أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فاذكروني أذكركم واشكروا لي ولا تكفرون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا استعينوا بالصبر والصلاة إن الله مع الصابرين. ولا تقولوا لمن يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. ولنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين. وبشر الصابرين الذين إذا أصابتهم مصيبة قالوا إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. أولئك عليهم صلوات من ربهم ورحمة وأولئك هم المهتدون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوض أمري إلى الله، إن الله بصير بالعباد، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد، اللهم صل. وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. قل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الدين عند الله الإسلام. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman across the globe, Salamun alaykum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: how do I know God really exists? We have been discussing the quest for meaning, finding purpose in our life. And we said that in order to understand this purpose and understand our meaning and why we are here, we must understand how I developed my thought process, how I developed my worldview, how I developed my narrative. And was this something that I consciously and actively worked to develop, or is this something that I just inherited? Sometimes consciously or sometimes subconsciously. That is it possible that based on the time and space in which I exist, I have gotten a certain worldview. And in this process, we explained that in the last 200 years, how a particular worldview and narrative has developed in order to understand that what are the things that influence our worldview. Now, at the same time, we have been having a conversation about science, and we've been having a conversation about the modern progress, evolution, Darwinism, and many other factors that go into the equation of understanding our world. From the vantage point in the school of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, the foundational layer is Tawheed. All roads point back to Tawheed. That is, God Almighty and His monotheism and His oneness and His unity in all those aspects. And the way that we live and exist in this world, that is, the thoughts, the ideas, they manifest themselves in words. Those words become actions. Those actions then become our character and our being and our destiny ultimately. But all of that should be based on the concept of Tawheed. At the same time, we should not think at any moment that we are devoid of progress or we are against progress or anything of that nature. But what we should consider is that when we look at our modern world, again, like the elephants and the blind men, that we may be looking at one aspect through scientism, one aspect through evolution, one aspect through Darwinism, and even those aspects may be incomprehensive, or they may not be uncomprehensive. They may not be comprehensive. Why? Because there are theories, and theories by nature evolve over time as we learn and know more. I want to say this and speak particularly to that young person or old who has gone through or is interested in science and mathematics and all of these modern technology, engineering, and on the likes. By no means is Islam in contradiction to this. Rather, what we are saying and we are thinking about, what is that era where both elements flourished in the life of a Muslim? So, in getting towards that end, I want to discuss with you a few brief elements about, number one, what was the era of Islam where there was flourishing of Islamic sciences as well as secular sciences? Number two, what was the view of the Ahlul Bayt and how did they explain this concept of God and God consciousness and God-centric nature to the people who are there? How did the life of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, especially Imam Al-Hussein, and his message and his mission resonate with the concept of God through the words of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam? What was the proof and evidence as proved in modern science about the existence of God, and how you and I can have solid, rock solid evidence in this so that we do not live in a state of doubt and uncertainty throughout our life? And finally, who is that individual who on the plains of Karbala showed very clearly and very categorically his certainty and belief, not only in Allah, not only in the Ahlul Bayt, but in the mission of his beloved Father? This is our stages of analysis for the next few moments that we are together. From the bottom of your heart, wherever you may be across the globe, send a salawat on Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Islam, as I alluded to in the previous lectures, there was an era of time in Europe from 1500 to 1800. This is 1500 where the Renaissance was emerging, the Renaissance, and 1800, the Enlightenment period. This era is when the West began to flourish. But at the same time, it should be noted that the Muslim civilizations in the Islamic world during this time had been flourishing during, for example, the Ottomans, or before them, the Arab civilizations, the Persian civilizations, and the Muslim world had flourished. And many of the Muslim world did not bat an eye to Europe and did not realize what was happening in the Renaissance, did not realize what was happening in the Enlightenment, because many people in the Islamic civilizations believed that they were superior on almost every front. Now, this negligence and this lack of consideration that knowledge can be anywhere, as I've alluded to in the previous lectures, that knowledge is the lost property of a believer from the Islamic perspective, that you should get it from wherever you can attain it. Europe began to rise during this period of 300 years. And what was the catalyst that led to that? The catalyst that led to this movement was the printing press of Gutenberg. Gutenberg invents the printing press. This was that invention which allowed the knowledge to spread like wildfire throughout Europe. The Gutenberg printing press was the internet of its day, the internet of its time, and it allowed for access to knowledge and access to books to be rampant, and knowledge began to spread like wildfire throughout Europe. Now, it should be noted here as well that this same printing press was brought to the Muslim world, we are told, and many of the rulers, particularly the Ottomans, were not too keen on this. The reasons they gave, for example, were that their employees, the scribes, may lose their jobs, the calligraphers may lose their jobs. One principle that history teaches us, that when technology emerges, technology does not care about any of the dynamics of how you feel. It will run you over. Therefore, one should consider those elements and how they have an impact on you and on society. And there may be other ways to adopt these resources and utilize them, such as maybe those are the people who can create technology for the printing press, an Islamic printing press, for example, or an Arabic or a Persian or a Turkish one, that is designed by the calligraphers and run by the calligraphers, who add to and complement what already exists. Nonetheless, for whatever reason, they did not adopt it. Some say it was because they didn't want them to lose their jobs. Some say it is because they did not want the general masses to become educated. Because if the general masses became educated, then the rulers would lose their power. Therefore, it was a form of keeping power strong. Now, the Gutenberg printing press was quite interesting in Europe in particular because all of this is very important to understand worldview. It was very important because it was a time where Protestantism, that is the Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther, was just taking hold. When the printing press emerged, it allowed for copies of the Protestant Reformation to be circulated and distributed. And this led to and encouraged people to begin to read. The Protestant movement in Christianity led people and encouraged people to read the Bible on their own. The narrative before Protestant Christianity was that the Bible was only to be read by and led by and interpreted by at the altar. That is, the priest was the one who had a monopoly, so to speak, on the Bible. Whereas Protestantism, coupled with the Gutenberg printing press, led to an environment where people began to read more throughout Europe and ultimately throughout all of the European colonies. I say this because one thing that is lost in history is what were some of the earliest books that were printed on the Gutenberg printing press. The first book is the Bible, we're told, number one. The second book that was printed on the Gutenberg printing press, we are told, was the works of St. Augustine. And the third element, which I want to draw your attention to in particular, is a book called the Canon, or the Canon of Medicine, by a man by the name of Avicenna, or in Arabic, Ibn Sina. This was the works of Avicenna or Ibn Sina, the Canon of Medicine, which was the main textbook in medicine that was used throughout the world, and in particular in Europe, all the way up until the 1600s. It was a landmark work, and it was considered the most comprehensive work in medicine. Why do I say this? Because if you go back to the pages of history, 800 to 1100 AD. This era in time is called that era which is the era of the golden age of Islam, where there is numerous sciences that are flourishing. Now, there are arguments and fair arguments at that much of this was patronage was done by the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and much of this was in order to divert attention away from the Imams. Nonetheless, I want to highlight a few people which I shed some light on in the last conversation. In the last conversation, we talked about the Darwinian theory of evolution, which gave rise and was one of the three elements that led to modernity in the modern world, along with evolution, Darwinism, and ultimately this narrative of progress. And progress was solely in the material sense, either in capitalism or in communism. Both of them looked solely at the material realm. Therefore, having said all of these things, the concept of evolution and the concept of Darwinian evolution was influenced heavily by the Islamic scholars of Al-Jahiz, Naqshbandi, and Al-Tusi. Tusi is who I want to highlight in particular, because this person is at once perhaps arguably the greatest scientist, mathematician of his time, and he's also the greatest scholar of his time religiously. Nasiruddin al-Tusi is a person who Copernicus's model of this model where the earth is the center of the universe and not the sun, which the church fought adamantly, this narrative that Copernicus had, his model, if you look at the diagram of Copernicus, you will notice it matches verbatim to the model or the diagram created by Nasiruddin al-Tusi. In fact, the only differences that you will find is where there is an A or a B or a C of the Latin in Copernicus's work, you will find the Arabic letter of Alif or Ba or Ta in the works of al-Tusi. But of course, Tusi's work came earlier. Therefore, one who's reading history knows that Tusi's work heavily influenced the work of Copernicus. So how is it that someone is the greatest scholar religiously as well as, arguably, as well as the greatest scientist of their time? What was the worldview? According to scholars, this worldview of Muslims, whether it was Tusi or whether it was Avicenna or Ibn Sina, that religion was not devoid of progress. That is, when they were studying medicine, in the case of Ibn Sina or Avicenna, or they were studying, for example, physics, in the case of Al-Tusi, that was not devoid of God. They were seeing this from the lens of God, from the perspective that is a God-centric world. They were wearing the lens of that. You and I, we should, as the scholars, the ulama, such as Sayyid Sistani, may Allah protect him, gives advice to young people. He says, go and study in the top institutions and go and specialize as much as possible, wherever possible, and try to become the best doctors and lawyers and engineers and X, Y, and Z. You fill in the blank profession. Try to do all of those things and try to become the best at it. But at the same time, also contribute to the literature. Write the books, write the textbooks, write all of those things. And of course, reading parenthetically and not directly from the literature, but the idea was you see this from the perspective and the vantage point of a God-centric world and a world where the Ahlul Bayt have taught us the principles of God Almighty so that we may implement it and so that we can actually act upon it. So when we say, what's the worldview? When we say, where did your worldview come from? When we say that evolution, Darwinism, progress led to this narrative of modernity, of material progress, of material modernity, which is devoid of God, much of what the commentators say and the experts say is we're living in a world today that is looking for happiness in the forgetfulness of God. That is, you're trying to remember God only when you need Him in the most dire of situations. If you recall the study that was conducted on young people and religion in America, that looked at those three elements, that found that most young people cannot articulately speak about what they believe. Most young people in America, with respect to their faith, they don't believe faith is that important or religion is that important. And finally, they follow moralistic, therapeutic deism, a form of God who's on the periphery, who is a God of convenience, who is a God who's there when I need Him and not there otherwise. The narrative of the Ahlul Bayt, the narrative of Islam, is not that. Rather, the narrative is that the focus, the focal point, the essence of our life is God-centric. And we should focus on that predominantly. And by virtue of that, we are good people. We should be good people. To be honest, fair, ethical, and care for others the same way we would want to be cared for. Whether that's our neighbor, or someone we work with, or someone we go to school with. Those are all parts of our responsibilities to our brethren in faith and our equals in humanity, as Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen says. So we're looking at reviving this worldview of a world of progress, but also one that is God-centric. Not one where I am living an excessively scientific scientism-driven world. You see, the problem with scientism is that many times, whether people realize it or not, they try to create a substitute for religion in the form of science. I again repeat to you, I come from a scientific background. I'm an engineer by training. Having studied the sciences, I encourage that. In Sayyid Sistani, echoing the words of Samahat Sayyid Sistani, that we should go for the modern sciences, the modern academics. But one should not go and adopt solely the worldview of total skepticism and total doubt and say that I don't believe in God, and then still become a quote-unquote rational scientist. You need to be cognizant of the underlying underpinnings of the philosophy of science. That's the essence. Philosophy has a scientific element and a philosophical element which underpins it. And understanding that dynamic is very important, and understanding that dynamic is very important for a particular space. Again, the elephant and the blind man. It's particular to that trunk of the elephant, to the tusk of the elephant, to the ear of the elephant, for example, but not all of it. The whole picture is the God-centric view, the God-centric world. We're told there's a moment in time where two atheists are sitting in the vicinity of the Kaaba during the time of the sixth Imam, during the time of Imam Sadiq, during the time of Hajj. This man, he's sitting with his comrade. One of them, the man's name is Ibn Awja. He begins to talk to his comrade. There were atheists at that time as well. Again, we're not making a moral argument on these individuals. An individual is allowed to have a doubt. But if one is suspending their belief and saying, I don't have the answer, you're seeking the answer, very well. But one to deny actively God, that's a different story altogether. And we're not making a moral argument here, we're saying the principles. Atheists were there during the time of the Imams as well. These two are conversing in the vicinity of the Kaaba. Ibn Awja says, you see, all of these people who are circumambulating, most of them are animals. His words, not mine. He says, except that one there. And he points to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He said, what's special about him? What's peculiar about him? He says, that individual, if he wants to become it's as if he wants to become a spirit, he can become a spirit. And if a spirit wants to become in human form, it would be him. He's something else. He said, what do you mean? Explain. He says, it happened one day that I was sitting in his vicinity and he looked at me and he said, what do you believe and what they believe is not the same. He said, I looked at him and I said, what do you mean? He said, well, how is it? I believe what they believe. He looked back at me and said, no. He said, for they believe in a resurrection. They believe in a hereafter, a life hereafter. You don't believe in that. And if it is the case that what they say is true, that there is resurrection, there is a hereafter, there is another life, and you believe that is not the case, then you will have a different result than they do. And if it is the case of what you believe, that is that there is nothing after this, there is no meaning, there is no purpose, there is no existence, then you and him, then those people will be the same. And then that cannot be the same. That cannot be the truth because they do not believe that. He said, what? And then he began to ask. The man says, I began to ask him further. And he began to give me more detail. It was as if the Imam was outlining what is known as Pascal's wager. Now, one may say this is not a comprehensive proof and a comprehensive analysis, but it is enough to explore and to assess and say, I need to investigate this more. The idea that a man comes to our Imam and says, oh Imam, how do you know that this world, this life, that you are living this honest life of integrity and sacrificing and all of these things, and that you die tomorrow, there's nothing? Imam responds, if I die, I will have died in a state of satisfaction. I will have died in a state of happiness. I would have died knowing that I live an honest life. So as to say, as we say, he would be able to sleep at night or sleep for eternity with peace. He said, but what will you do? What would you do? If tomorrow there is resurrection, if tomorrow there is judgment, if tomorrow there is a court that you must just respond to, he said, then all of your life will be in question. and I will still be in peace and tranquility because I have nothing to fear. This led that man to consider. Pascal's wager is the first use of probability theory or decision analysis, where Pascal, or Blaise Pascal, the inventor of what we call the predecessor to the calculator, he says that if one is to choose between assuming there is a God and an afterlife and assuming that there is not, it is much better to assume that there is a hereafter. This is what we're getting at. The Imam told that man. Another man came to Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam, and he said, what's your proof for God? How do you know He exists? What's the dalil? What's the evidence? At that point in time, we're told, the Imam knew that the man had gone for many sea voyages. When the man had gone to many sea voyages, and at the ocean and the sea, he said, have you ever been at sea? And there comes a moment in time where the waves begin to ripple, and the winds begin to blow. And eventually your ship is going and rocking back and forth in the water. And when it's rocking back and forth in the water, there's a moment where the winds become so turbulent and the oceans become so turbulent. And you begin to call on to something or call out to something. He said, yes, it happens. And it's happened before. More than once. That I was at sea and I called on to something. I called out. He said, that's your Lord. That's your God. That intrinsic fitrah, that nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that God Almighty has put in your heart, that's the fitrah, that the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that nature that the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam came in order to metaphorically hold our hand and take us back towards that cable, that rope of God Almighty. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, that hold on fast to the rope of Allah or the cable of Allah. The Arabic word is habl. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ, that is the cable of Allah. You know, the English word that we use, cable, the root word of that is actually habl. Cable comes from the Arabic word habl. That cable of God that is connecting us and keeping this universe moving and keeping it calculated and keeping it in balance and in moderation, that's God. And that's what we are trying to strive back to, the God-centric view, worldview of how we see the world. What's the proof? What's the evidence? We're told that a man by the name of Antony Flew, never forget this name, Antony Flew was the greatest atheist of the 20th century. A man who had given philosophical proof after philosophical proof on why he believed in atheism and why others should as well. And one after the other he gave this dalil, he gave this proof, he gave this evidence. This same individual, a few years before his death, he writes a book, says why there is a God. He scratches out the is not, the not. And he says why there is a God. He said, why? Why, Antony Flew? After so many years, you were the reason, many atheists argued, you were the reason why we adopted atheism. You changed your view? Have you lost your mind, so to speak? What happened? He said, two things did not allow me to continue in my atheism. He said, what? What is it? He said, first, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking, he says the example of our universe coming into existence is like putting a group of monkeys into a lab. And you put them into a room and you put a typewriter in the room. And when you put this typewriter in the room, these monkeys, these chimpanzees, they begin to type away at the typewriter. And not after some time, not do they produce a word or a sentence or, for example, a paragraph. Rather, they produce the sonnets of Shakespeare. That is the example of how this universe came to be. It just probabilistically happened. There was a German physicist who was reading this work, and he said, really, Mr. Hawking? And he said that this example of what you're saying, the British Council of Arts has actually done a study like this, where they've actually put chimpanzees into a room, and they've observed what has happened. And he said that after some time, the chimpanzees did not even go near the typewriter in the first week or two. He said eventually they went towards the typewriter and they began to use it as, not my words, but his words, a toilet. And after that, they eventually began to type and push the buttons on the typewriter. Now, bear in mind, after a period of time, these monkeys produced 50 pages of content. Now, in the English language, the shortest word is a or I, requiring that before and after there is a space. As a result of this, at the end of the equation, after 50 pages, the researchers were looking for a word within this content. They did not find a single word, let alone a sentence, let alone a paragraph, let alone poetry that rhymes in the form of the sonnets of Shakespeare. Then the physicist continues to crunch the numbers. When he crunched the numbers, he said that the probability of our universe coming into existence by accident is this number. But before I tell you the number, he says, and one should know that there is a concept in mathematics and in statistics called statistical zero. That is, if the number is this small, it's as good as zero. What is that number? It is 1 over 10 raised to the 50th power. Or 0.0 followed by 49, 50, 49 zeros. That is that number. Now, also note that the number of seconds that have passed by since the Big Bang Theory, what is that number? I'll tell you that in a moment. The number that was crunched by the German physicist came out to the probability of our universe coming by chance is 1 over 10 raised to the 620th power. He said that's 0.0 followed by 600 zeros. Do you know how many seconds have passed since the Big Bang? 10 to the 18th power. That means that the probability of our universe coming into existence by accident is so small. It's much smaller than all of the seconds that have passed. The probability, it is much smaller than statistical zero. So if you are wagering on it, what would you wager on? Would you wager on something that you cannot fathom how small the chance is? What would your probability tell you? What would your logic tell you? What would your rationale tell you? He said this was the first element, the response to Stephen Hawking's that made me think. Who says this? Anthony Flew, who changed his belief system. They said, what is the main thing? What is the second thing that made you change your belief system? What was it? He said 3 letters. What were the letters? What were they? He says, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. What? DNA? How? He says DNA, when he studied it and he realized how much information is encoded in DNA, he says that the amount, for the audience to know, there is so much information that is encoded in DNA through the base pairs, adenine, guanine, cytosine, the likes, thymine, these things, these 4 base pairs combined, all the information that is encoded, it tells us the skin color, it tells us our hair, it tells our genetic makeup. No, in fact, science is showing, it shows us and tells us our behavior. All of that is encoded in our DNA. He said the amount of information that is encoded in a human being's DNA is how much? It is such a number, saving you all the mathematics. We don't have that much data. With all the boom of data science, with all the boom of everything, we don't have that much data in our world today. We will not hit that number until the middle of 2025, 2026. That's how much data is in DNA. He says that is programmed, that is encoded. Whenever you see something coded, whenever you see that something has been programmed, know there is a programmer. That led him to believe in God. Therefore, I summarize in the words of Francis Bacon, the founder of the scientific method, the person who gave rise to the scientific method in the West. Francis Bacon says, a little bit of knowledge inclines a man or leads a man towards atheism. Depth of knowledge leads a man towards God. Develop that depth of knowledge and you will notice your life will change and you will become more God-centric, the way the Ahlul Bayt envisioned. This is for others who may not be so inclined. For you and I, the words of Sayyid Shuhada, the words of Imam Al-Hussein are sufficient, where he says, my Lord, my Creator, in the plains of Arafah, he says, what has he gained who has lost you? And what has he lost who has gained you? This was the same manhaj and viewpoint that was echoed in the actions of Imam Al-Kadhim alayhi salam. He's in the dungeons, he's in the prisons. But he is the one who's converting the people who have gone astray through his actions. Of course he's an Imam. But in that solitude he found the environment to be able to worship his Lord. The Imam is saying, the third Imam, Imam Sayyid Shuhada, is saying the same thing. He's saying, as the grandfather of Imam Al-Kadhim, that what has he lost who has gained you, my Lord? Those terms, those words that he says in Dua Arafah, Imam Sayyid Shuhada, what does he say? My Lord, by the matrices of the teeth, by the body, by the socket and the jaw, by the aorta, and it is as if he is giving a complete anatomical study of the human body, the rib cage, every element, the eyes, the nose, the teeth, the veins, the capillaries. All of those elements the Imam is highlighting, as if he is asking us, do you think these came by accident? These came from nowhere? The Imam had absolute certainty. We may not be able to get to the certainty of the Imam. But do I take the compass that the Imam pointed me towards? Do I look at the Quran? How much of my being is built based on the Quran? How many verses of the Quran? Over 6,000 verses. How many of those verses give rise to who I am? How many? The sayings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. How many of those sayings make who I am as a person? Remember, thoughts give rise to actions. How many of those prophetic traditions, those traditions of the infallibles, those verses of the Quran, how many of them make my being? That's my worldview. That's your worldview. And in that you will find progress, in that you will find modernity, in that you will find evolution and progress. But in that you will find one very important thing, and that is you will find peace and tranquility, even in difficult times. This is what the companions of Imam Al-Hussein found. We're told on the day of Ashura, Imam Al-Hussein's companions have gone towards the battlefield. We are told that when the companions have all sacrificed their life, the family emerges. Who is the first one who is excelling towards the battlefield? Who is it? It is Ali al-Akbar, the one who resembled the Holy Prophet Rasul al-A'zam in the way he walked, the way he talked, the way he interacted with the people. In every way he reflected the Holy Prophet. Ali al-Akbar approaches his father. He says, my father, allow me the permission to go towards the battlefield. Allow me to sacrifice my life. Allow me to protect you, and allow me to deliver you victory. Allah knows only how. Sayyid Shuhada gave him the permission. Allah only knows how a father allows his son to go and sacrifice his life. Sayyid al-Shuhada allows Ali Akbar to go. When he allows him to go, Ali al-Akbar, he proceeds towards the battlefield. When he proceeds towards the battlefield, he faces the army, he faces the enemy, and he calls out to them, and he says, Ana Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali. I am Ali, the son of Hussein, the son of Ali. Do you know who I am? And I will strike you, and I will fight you, and I will protect my father. He gives this speech, and this gives this statement towards the enemy, and he begins to strike, and he begins to fight very courageously. When the enemy, when the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad see this, they begin to say, who is this? This is the son of Hussein. This is the grandson of Ali. He will not be able to finish him like this. What did they do? They surrounded him. They ambushed him. When they ambushed him, they struck him when he was struck. We are told this moment is as if time had stopped. Because why? Because there was a mother in the tent who, Layla, just a moment before this ambush, he had gone back. Ali and Al-Akbar had gone back to the tents. When he went back to the tents, he called out, Al-Atash, Al-Atash, the thirst, my father. The Imam alayhi salam said, my son, your grandfather will quench your thirst from Kawthar. Go and bid your farewell to your mother Layla. He goes to the tent. Allah knows how a mother sees her son like this. He bids his salams, his salutations. Allah knows how he was able to separate himself from Layla again. When he went back, he fought. That's when he was finally ambushed and struck. He fell towards the ground. Aliun al-Akbar. He calls out, Ab ya Hussein, my father, Hussein, come to my assistance. They say Imam Al-Hussein ran towards him. But what happened? There was a commotion in the battlefield. They say that the horse went in the wrong direction. Rather than going towards the tents of Imam Al-Hussein, it began to go more towards the enemies. They began to strike them, and they began to strike Ali al-Akbar. How? Because they wanted to break the heart of Hussein. They began to throw stones at Ali Akbar. Whoever had something, they threw it towards him. Imam Al-Hussein was trying to get his son. When he got to Ali al-Akbar, he began to take him back. Some say that it was a father and his son, that the Imam said, O children of Banu Hashim, take your brother back towards the tent. They say Ali al-Akbar's body got back to the tent. Layla was there. Allah knows how Layla saw the body of Ali al-Akbar. May Allah never show anyone the day. We are told that this hurt broke the heart of Abu Abdullah, and it broke the heart of Layla, because Ali al-Akbar was the dearest. They broke the heart of Hussein.
هذا الرمح بفادة ثنى، وهذا به لن الشاب رنى، وهذا الخيل صدر رضرضنا، وهذا وذاك بالهند يموذر. The companions of Imam Al-Hussein had fallen one after the other until not a single one of them was left. Ali al-Akbar was the first of Banu Hashim to approach his father. He would come to Imam Al-Hussein. He would stand in front of him. He said to him, "O father, allow me to go into the battlefield to defend you." Imam al-Hussein, Ali al-Akbar, was the only one that Imam al-Hussein never gave permission to by using words of going to the battlefield. Rather, he would start to cry, and Ali al-Akbar would witness the tears of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein on his cheeks, and he knew that that was his permission to go into the battlefield. أجركم الله. Ali al-Akbar would wear his armature. He would go into the battlefield shouting, أنا علي ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali, أضربكم بالسيف أحمي عن أبي ضرب غلام هاشمي علوي. I am Ali, son of Hussein, son of Ali. I hit you with my sword, defending my father. The hit of a true Hashemite. Ajarakum Allah. That and Layla would look at the face of Imam al-Hussein. She would look at the face of Imam al-Hussein. She sees him happy. She knows that her son is doing well. She knows that her son is safe. Then she sees that Imam al-Hussein's face would change. She sees the look of worry on Abu Abdullah al-Hussein's face. She shouts, Wa walada huwa aliyah. Then she says to him, Oh Hussein, what has befallen my son? He says to her, do not worry, nothing has happened to your son, but someone has just approached him who is possibly one of the strongest of the Arabs. Oh Layla, go back into your tent and pray for your son, for I heard my grandfather Rasulullah say that the mother who prays for her son, her dua is mustajab, it is accepted. Ajarakumullah. She would go back into the tent praying towards Allah. What would she say? She says to him, Oh Allah, I ask you by Abu Abdullah, I ask you by the stranger of Karbala, oh Allah, the one who returned Joseph to Jacob, return Ali safely to me. طبت لعد خيمتها الغريبة تبكي على بنها بريبة، والله توسلت لله بحبيبة وبالحسين وش ما أبي مصيبة. يا راد يوسف من مغيبة ليعقوب ومسكن حيبة، هي والله أريد أن علي سالم هم تجيبه. Ajarakum Allah. She would carry on in this prayer until she would fall unconscious. At that point, Ali al-Akbar would return to his father. He says to him, Oh Father Hussein, the heaviness of the metal has made me tired, and this battle has made me thirsty. Imam al-Hussein said to him, Go back into the battlefield. For you will be martyred soon, and your grandfather Rasulullah will give you a cup, after which you will never go thirsty again. But just before you go back to the tent and send your final farewells to your mother. He would come into the tent. Layla, in what state? She would be lying on the floor unconscious. Imagine Ali al-Akbar would see in that state. Some narrations tell us that he sat by her head. He would start to cry. The tears that would fall from his cheek. Imagine this. The tears that would fall from his cheek down on her face would wake her up. Ajarakumullah. She would wake up to see Ali al-Akbar with her. She would say to him, Oh Ali, stay with me. He said to her, Oh mother, I will make you proud. out by Fatima Zahra. He would go back into the battlefield fighting like a brave warrior until they would surround him. Someone would hit him with an arrow on his forehead. Ajarakumullah. He would lean on his horse. The blood would spill on the eyes of the horse. The horse would start running towards the tents of the enemies. The enemies took this as their chance. Yes, they took him off his horse. Ajarakumullah. They put him on the floor. They started cutting him into pieces with their swords and with their spears. He would shout, Abba ya Hussein, alayka minni salam. Imam Al-Hussein would start rushing towards Ali Al-Akbar, ajarakumullah. But in what state? When he reached him, the narrations would tell us, he would jump on him just like an eagle would jump on its prey. He would jump off his horse, ajarakumullah. He would lie beside his body. He would look at Ali Al-Akbar. Some poets describe this beautifully. علي راح علي راح الصفق بيده وصاح علي راح صاحب صوت يا زينب علي راح يا خويا وسودت الدنيا علي. He would look at Ali Al-Akbar in this state. He sees him that he looks in one direction, he would smile. He sees him looking at the other direction, he would start to cry. He says to him, oh Ali Al-Akbar, why is it that you look towards this side you smile and towards this side you cry? This is very painful. He says to him, Father Hussein, this is my grandfather Rasulullah. He is holding a cup of water after which I will never go thirst. So Ali Akbar, why'd you cry? He says to him, Father Hussein, this is Fatima Zahra, my grandmother. Every time a tear would drop from your eye, she would start to slap her face and hurt. فاطم لو خلت الحسين مجدلا وقد مات عطشانا بشط فراتي إذا أن لطمت الخد فاطم عنده وأجريت دمع العين في الوجنات والله وأجريت دمع العين في الوجنات لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله.
صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، صلى الله عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، صلى الله عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين.